The crisp mountain air of Boulder, Colorado, bit at Jacob Williams' face as he adjusted his backpack straps. Next to him, Sarah pulled her fleece jacket tighter, her breath forming little clouds in the October morning. They'd chosen today for their anniversary hike, marking 10 years of marriage with a trek up the Wildwood Trail. The parking lot was nearly empty at this early hour, just how they liked it. "Ready for an adventure?" Jacob asked, checking his phone's GPS one last time before tucking it into his pocket. Sarah nodded, but something in her expression seemed off, a slight tension around her eyes that hadn't been there during their previous hikes. The trail started gently enough, winding through tall pines that creaked softly in the wind. Sarah walked a few steps ahead, her hiking boots crunching on the scattered pine needles. From behind, Jacob watched her ponytail swing back and forth, golden hair catching the fragments of sunlight that broke through the canopy. They'd done this trail before, but never this late in the season. The autumn colors made everything look different, more dramatic somehow. Their footsteps fell into a rhythm as they climbed higher, the path gradually becoming steeper. Other hikers passed them occasionally, exchanging quick greetings before moving on. Sarah barely acknowledged them, lost in her thoughts. The silence between them felt heavy, unusual for a couple who normally chatted easily about everything and nothing. "Remember our first hike together?" Jacob tried breaking the quiet. "You wore those ridiculous fashion boots and complained the whole way up." Sarah's laugh came out forced. "Yeah, I learned my lesson pretty quick." She paused, adjusting her water bottle in its holder. Things were simpler then, weren't they? The trail curved sharply upward, and conversation dropped off as they focused on their footing. The pine forest began thinning out, revealing glimpses of the valley below through gaps in the trees. The view was spectacular, autumn colors painting the landscape in rich golds and reds, the town of Boulder looking tiny in the distance. But neither of them stopped to admire it. As they approached the first major viewpoint, Jacob noticed Sarah checking her phone more frequently, despite the spotty reception. Each time, she'd frown slightly before putting it away. He said nothing, but his jaw tightened. The perfect anniversary hike he planned was feeling more tense by the minute. The path narrowed as they climbed higher, hugging the mountainside. To their right, the cliff dropped away steeply. Warning signs marked the edge, their red letters faded by sun and weather. "Danger, steep cliff edge, stay on marked trail." Sarah walked closer to the inner edge of the path, one hand occasionally brushing the rock face for balance. The wind picked up as they reached higher elevation, carrying the sweet scent of pine mixed with the earthy smell of fallen leaves. Jacob pulled out their water bottle, offering it to Sarah first. She took it without meeting his eyes, took a small sip, and handed it back. Their fingers didn't touch during the exchange. "We should get some photos at the overlook," Jacob suggested, his voice carefully casual. "The light's perfect right now." The sun had risen higher, casting dramatic shadows across the valley below. Sarah nodded absently, still avoiding his gaze. They reached the main overlook just before noon. The spot was famous for its panoramic views, with a natural rock platform jutting out over the valley. Usually crowded with tourists, today it was deserted, probably due to the threatening clouds gathering in the distance. Sarah walked to the edge, her back to Jacob, her shoulders tense. "Jacob," she said finally, turning to face him, "we need to talk about what I found." The wind whipped her words away, but Jacob heard them clearly enough. His face, already pink from exertion, darkened slightly. "This isn't the place, Sarah." "Then where is?" Her voice rose slightly. "You've been avoiding this conversation for weeks. The missing money, the fake accounts. Did you think I wouldn't figure it out?" Jacob stepped closer, glancing around reflexively, though they were alone. "Keep your voice down."
"Why?"
"There's nobody here to hear how you've been stealing from the company." Sarah's hands were shaking now, but her voice was steady. "I saw the transfers, Jacob. I know what you've done." The wind gusted stronger, pulling at their clothes and hair. Dark clouds loomed closer, promising rain. Jacob took another step toward his wife, his expression unreadable. Sarah backed up slightly, one foot scraping against loose gravel near the edge. What happened next took only seconds, but would be replayed countless times in the coming investigation. A struggle, a scream cut short, the sound of falling rocks. Then silence, broken only by the wind and the distant rumble of thunder. Hours later, Jacob Williams stumbled into the ranger station, his clothes dirty and torn, his face streaked with what looked like tears. His story came out in broken sentences: a tragic accident, a photo gone wrong, a desperate attempt to reach her. The rangers called for search and rescue immediately, but something in Jacob's manner made them uneasy. His hands shook as he described the incident, but his eyes remained dry. When asked to point out the exact location on a map, his finger wavered between several different overlooks. As the first raindrops began to fall, search teams spread out along the Wildwood Trail. Behind them, Jacob sat in the ranger station, answering questions with increasing agitation. Outside, thunder rolled across the mountains, and the perfect anniversary hike became the beginning of a murder investigation that would shock the entire community. Detective Amanda Hayes stood at the edge of the Wildwood Trail overlook, her boots planted firmly on the wet ground. The rain had finally stopped, but the morning mist still clung to the mountainside, making the search difficult. Her team had been working since dawn, combing the area where Jacob Williams claimed his wife had fallen. "Detective, you need to see this." Officer Martinez waved her over to a spot about 20 feet from the main viewpoint. The ground here showed signs of disturbance: broken twigs, scuffed earth, and something that made Hayes' stomach tighten: small drops of blood on a jagged rock. "Mark it and get forensics up here," she ordered, pulling out her phone to document the scene. The official story, that Sarah Williams had accidentally fallen while taking a photo, wasn't adding up. The disturbed area was too far from where tourists typically stood for photos, and the pattern of broken vegetation suggested a struggle rather than a single person's fall. Back at the station, Jacob Williams sat in the interview room, his third cup of coffee going cold in front of him. He'd changed clothes since yesterday but hadn't shaved, and dark circles ringed his eyes. Hayes watched him through the one-way glass, noting how he kept checking his watch, how his right leg bounced continuously under the table. "Mr. Williams," Hayes said as she entered the room, "we need to go over your statement again." She sat down across from him, spreading out photographs of the trail. "You said Sarah was taking a photo when she fell?" Jacob nodded quickly, too quickly, Hayes thought. "Yes, she wanted a picture of the valley. She stepped back to get a better angle and..." His voice cracked. "I tried to grab her, but I couldn't reach her in time." "And this happened at the main overlook?" Hayes pushed a map toward him. "Can you mark the exact spot?" Jacob's hand trembled as he picked up the pen. He hesitated, the pen hovering over the paper. It was around here, I think. Everything happened so fast." Hayes leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Williams, we found signs of a disturbance quite far from the photo spot. Can you explain that?" "What do you mean, disturbance?" Jacob's voice took on a defensive edge. "I told you I tried to save her. I ran along the edge, trying to see where she'd fallen. Maybe that's what you found." But Hayes was watching his hands, the way his fingers curled into fists when she mentioned the disturbed ground, the fresh scratches across his knuckles that hadn't been there in the first photographs taken at the ranger station. The investigation moved quickly over the next few days. Search teams with dogs worked their way down the steep cliff face while drones buzzed overhead, scanning the terrain. Hayes coordinated from a makeshift command center in the park ranger station, surrounded by maps and growing piles of evidence bags. "Detective," a young officer called out, hurrying into the room with a tablet. "We got the surveillance footage from the trail parking lot." They huddled around the screen, watching grainy footage of Jacob and Sarah arriving that morning. The video quality was poor, but their body language was clear. Sarah standing apart from Jacob, her arms crossed, while he gestured animatedly. "Timestamp shows this was just before they started hiking," the officer noted. "Doesn't look like a happy anniversary couple to me." Hayes nodded slowly, remembering Jacob's insistence that they'd been in good spirits that morning, excited about their anniversary hike. Another hole in his story. The forensics report arrived that afternoon. The blood found at the scene was definitely Sarah's type, and there was more of it than would be explained by a simple fall. More telling were the finger-shaped bruises photographed on Sarah's water bottle, which had been recovered from Jacob's backpack, bruises that suggested a violent struggle. At home that evening, Hayes spread the case files across her kitchen table, her dinner getting cold beside her. Something about Jacob's behavior kept nagging at her. It wasn't just the inconsistencies in his story or the physical evidence. It was the way he seemed more worried about checking his phone than finding his wife, how his concern appeared practiced rather than genuine. Her phone buzzed, a text from Martinez. They'd found a witness, someone who'd been hiking the trail that morning. The witness reported hearing raised voices near the overlook, followed by what sounded like an argument. They hadn't thought much of it at the time, but after seeing the news about the missing hiker, Hayes rubbed her tired eyes. The pieces were starting to come together, forming a picture very different from the tragic accident Jacob had described. Tomorrow, they'd bring him in for another interview. This time, she had a feeling he wouldn't be leaving so easily. The local news had already picked up the story, running headlines asking what had really happened on Wildwood Trail. Social media buzzed with theories and speculation. Had Sarah Williams really fallen while taking a photo? Or had something more sinister occurred on that remote mountain trail? As Hayes finally headed to bed, her phone lit up with another message. The forensics team had found something else in Jacob's backpack, a pair of hiking gloves belonging to Sarah, stuffed in a hidden pocket. They were covered in blood. The forensics lab hummed with activity as technicians processed evidence from the Wildwood Trail. Sarah's hiking gloves lay on a sterile steel table, each bloodstain carefully marked and photographed. The lead technician, Dr. Chun, pointed out the distinct pattern of the stains to Detective Hayes. See these smears here? They're consistent with someone trying to grab something, or someone, while their hands were already bloody. And these spatter patterns suggest force was involved. This wasn't from a simple fall. Hayes studied the photographs, noting how the blood patterns aligned with a scenario she'd been piecing together. The gloves told a story of struggle, of desperate grabbing and twisting. More importantly, they'd been hidden in Jacob's backpack, not dropped along the trail as they should have been if Sarah had really fallen accidentally. Meanwhile, across town, Officer Martinez interviewed the parking lot witness, Lisa Reeves, in more detail. They sat in a quiet corner of a coffee shop, away from curious ears. I arrived just as they were getting their gear out of their car, Lisa explained, wrapping her hands around her coffee mug. The woman, Sarah, she was saying something about files and evidence. The man kept trying to quiet her down, looking around like he was worried someone would hear. Could you make out exactly what they were saying? Martinez asked, his pen hovering over his notebook. Lisa frowned, concentrating. The woman said something like, "I've already made copies." That really seemed to upset him. He grabbed her arm. Not violently, but not gently either. That's when I decided to mind my own business and start my hike. Back at the station, the Financial Crimes Unit had been digging into Jacob's work history. Detective Singh walked into Hayes' office with a thick folder, dropping it on her desk with a thud. "You're going to want to see this," Singh said, opening the folder to reveal bank statements and transaction records. Jacob Williams wasn't just embezzling money. He was running a full-scale fraud operation through his investment firm. We're talking millions of dollars, all carefully hidden in a web of fake accounts and shell companies. Hayes leaned forward, scanning the documents. The numbers were staggering. More importantly, several large transfers had been made in the days leading up to the hiking trip. He was moving money around right before Sarah disappeared, she noted, circling dates with her pen. The investigation took another turn when Sarah's laptop was found in her home office. The IT team discovered she'd been doing her own investigation into Jacob's business dealings. Her browser history showed searches for whistleblower protection laws and contact information for financial regulatory authorities. A draft email to the SEC sat in her outbox, never sent, dated the day before the hike. Hayes sat in her car outside the Williams house, reviewing her notes. The neighborhood was quiet, upper middle class, with perfectly maintained lawns and expensive cars and driveways. The kind of place where people thought they were safe from violence. But Hayes knew better. Sometimes the most dangerous predators wore business suits and lived in houses with 3-car garages. Her phone rang, the The search teams had found something new. Near the base of the cliff, partially hidden under some brush, they discovered Sarah's phone. The screen was shattered, but the tech team thought they might be able to recover data from it. Hayes started her car, heading back to the station. They needed to move quickly now. Jacob Williams had been keeping up appearances, showing up at the police station daily to check on the search progress, giving tearful interviews to local news stations. But Hayes noticed how his act slipped when he thought no one was watching. The way his concerns seemed to vanish, replaced by calculation. "We found your wife's phone, Mr. Williams," Hayes said during their next interview. She watched his face carefully as she placed the damaged device in an evidence bag on the table between them. Jacob's expression flickered, surprise, then fear, quickly masked by relief. "Oh, thank God. Maybe this will help us understand what happened. Can you check her photos?" She was taking pictures right before. "Our tech team is working on that," Hayes cut him off. "But we're more interested in her text messages and emails, particularly the ones about your company's finances." The change was subtle but immediate. Jacob's shoulders tensed, his fingers drumming once on the table before he forced them still. "I don't know what you mean. Sarah wasn't involved in my business." "No." Hayes pulled out copies of the draft email to the SEC. "Then how do you explain this? She was planning to report your fraud scheme, wasn't she? That's what you were arguing about in the parking lot." Jacob's lawyer chose that moment to interrupt, placing a hand on his client's arm. "Detective, if you're implying something, make it clear. Otherwise, my client has nothing more to say." But Hayes had seen enough. The way Jacob's face had drained of color when she mentioned the SEC email told her everything she needed to know. Now they just needed to prove it. That evening, as Hayes updated the case board in her office, she added a new element to the timeline. Financial motive confirmed. The pieces were falling into place, revealing a picture of desperation, greed, and ultimately murder. Detective Hayes sat in her favorite diner, stirring her third cup of coffee while she waited for Megan Porter, Sarah's best friend, to arrive. The place was mostly empty this early in the morning, just a few regulars at the counter and the smell of bacon in the air. Hayes had chosen it specifically for its quiet atmosphere. People tended to open up more over coffee and pancakes than in sterile interview rooms. Megan arrived right on time, looking tired and drawn. She slid into the booth across from Hayes, declining the waitress's offer of coffee in favor of water. Her hands shook slightly as she took a sip. "Thanks for meeting me here," Hayes said, pushing a folder aside to make room for Megan's water glass. "I know you've already given your statement, but we need to understand more about Sarah's state of mind in the weeks before the incident." Megan nodded, twisting her wedding ring, a nervous habit Hayes had noticed during their previous conversations. "Sarah wasn't herself those last few weeks. She'd cancel our lunch dates, wouldn't answer texts for days. Then suddenly she'd call me at midnight, wanting to talk but never really saying what was wrong." "When did you first notice the change?" "About 2 months ago." Megan pulled out her phone, scrolling through messages. This was the first weird text from her. She asked me if I knew any good lawyers who specialized in financial crimes. I thought she was asking for a client or something. She worked with a lot of small businesses doing their books. Hayes leaned forward. "But it wasn't for a client, was it?" "No." Megan's voice cracked slightly. She found something in Jacob's work files. She was helping him organize his home office. They'd had a flood in the basement, and everything was a mess. She never told me exactly what she found, but it scared her. Meanwhile, across town, Detective Singh was building a different kind of case. He'd assembled a team of forensic accountants, and they'd taken over a conference room at the station. The walls were covered with financial flowcharts and transaction records. Red string connected different documents, creating a web of evidence that all pointed to Jacob's guilt. "Look at this pattern," Singh explained to Hayes when she returned from the diner. "Every month for the past 2 years, he's been moving money through these shell companies. Small amounts at first, but getting bigger. More careless. That's probably how Sarah noticed." Hayes studied the charts. He was getting desperate? Definitely. His last few transfers were sloppy, easier to trace. And look at the timing. Singh pointed to a cluster of transactions. These all happened the week before Sarah disappeared. He was trying to hide the money before she could report him. The break in the case came from an unexpected source. Sarah's younger sister, Emily, called Hayes late one evening. She'd been going through Sarah's things, trying to help their parents cope with the loss, when she found something tucked inside an old college yearbook. "It's a USB drive," Emily explained, her voice trembling over the phone. "Sarah and I used to hide things in that book when we were kids. It was like our secret spot. I think she wanted someone to find this." Hayes drove to Emily's house immediately. The USB drive was small and unmarked, the kind you could buy at any office supply store. But when they plugged it into Hayes' laptop, it revealed a goldmine of evidence: screenshots of banking transactions, copies of emails, photos of documents taken from Jacob's office. She was building her own case, Hayes realized, scrolling through the files, gathering evidence before she went to the authorities. The tech team worked through the night, analyzing the USB drive's contents. Sarah had been methodical, organizing everything by date and type. She'd even kept a log of conversations with Jacob, noting his reactions when she confronted him about small discrepancies she discovered. The next morning, Hayes called a meeting with her entire team. They gathered in the conference room, running on coffee and determination. Officer Martinez brought in a timeline he'd created, spanning the entire wall. "Here's what we know," Hayes began, standing in front of the group. "Sarah Williams discovered her husband's embezzlement scheme about 2 months ago. Instead of confronting him immediately, she started gathering evidence. She made copies of everything, stored them in multiple locations." "Smart woman," Singh commented. "She knew she needed proof." "Exactly." Hayes pointed to different points on the timeline. She consulted with lawyers, researched whistleblower protections, and planned to report everything to the SEC. But something changed. The day before the hike, she made one final copy of everything onto this USB drive and hid it where her sister would eventually find it. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Sarah had known she was in danger. The anniversary hike hadn't been a celebration. It had been Jacob's opportunity to silence her before she could expose his crimes. Martinez spoke up from the back of the room. The witness from the parking lot, the evidence of struggle at the Overlook, the blood on her gloves, it all fits. He didn't just kill her to keep her quiet. He planned it. Hayes nodded grimly. This wasn't a crime of passion or a tragic accident. This was premeditated murder. She turned to the group. "I want everything ready for the DA by tomorrow morning. Every piece of evidence, every witness statement, every financial record. Jacob Williams is about to discover that his wife was smarter than he gave her credit for." The team dispersed, each member knowing their role in building the case. In her office, Hayes added one final note to the case file. Victim documented her own murder investigation. Sarah's thoroughness might have cost her life, but it would also bring her justice. The interrogation room felt smaller than usual, its gray walls closing in as Hayes prepared for her confrontation with Jacob Williams. She'd arranged the evidence carefully. Photos from the crime scene, financial records, and Sarah's USB drive all placed in manila folders on the metal table. Each piece was a card she'd play at exactly the right moment. Jacob arrived with his lawyer, Richard Stern, a sharp-dressed man with cold eyes and an expensive watch. They took their seats across from Hayes, Stern immediately placing his briefcase on the table like a barrier between them. "Let's be clear, Detective," Stern began. "My client is here voluntarily to assist with finding his wife. Any suggestion of wrongdoing?" "I understand completely." Hayes cut in smoothly, opening the first folder. "Mr. Williams, could you explain these transfer records to me?" She slid several bank statements across the table, watching Jacob's face carefully. Jacob glanced at the papers, then at his lawyer. "I don't see how my business dealings are relevant to finding Sarah. Just humor me." Hayes pointed to a specific transaction. "This transfer, for example. $200,000 moved through 3 different shell companies, eventually landing in an offshore account. All on the day before your anniversary hike." Color drained from Jacob's face, but he maintained his composure. "Those are legitimate business transactions. My company deals with international investments. And these?" Hayes opened another folder, revealing more documents. Fraudulent accounts, falsified reports, systematic theft from your own clients. Sarah found all of this, didn't she? That's what the argument in the parking lot was about. Jacob's hands tightened into fists under the table. What argument? We were happy that morning. I've told you this already. We have a witness, Jacob. Hayes leaned forward. Someone who saw you grab Sarah's arm, who heard her talking about evidence and copies. Would you like me to play their statement for you? The room fell silent except for the soft hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Stern shifted in his chair, clearing his throat. Detective, if you're implying— I'm not implying anything, Hayes interrupted, her voice steady. I'm telling you that we know Sarah discovered your fraud scheme. We know she was planning to report you to the SEC. And we know that walk up Wildwood Trail wasn't really about celebrating your anniversary. Jacob's calm facade began to crack. A muscle twitched in his jaw, his breathing becoming more rapid. You can't prove any of this. Those documents could have been altered. Someone could be trying to frame me. Hayes pulled out Sarah's USB drive, placing it on the table between them. Your wife was thorough, Jacob. Every transaction, every fake account, every lie, she documented all of it. She knew what she was doing. My client doesn't have to listen to these accusations, Stern interjected, starting to stand. Sit down, Mr. Stern, Hayes said firmly. We haven't gotten to the best part yet. She opened the final folder, spreading out crime scene photos across the table. These blood patterns on Sarah's gloves, our forensics team says they're consistent with defensive wounds. She fought back, didn't she? Jacob's composure shattered. He stood up so quickly his chair scraped loudly against the floor. This is ridiculous. I loved Sarah. I tried to save her when she fell. You mean when you pushed her? Hayes remained seated, her voice level. After she told you she was going to expose your crimes? After she threatened to ruin everything you'd built? I want to leave, Jacob demanded, looking at his lawyer. We're done here. But Hayes wasn't finished. She pulled out one final piece of evidence, a printed copy of Sarah's draft email to the SEC, dated the day before her death. She was ready to send this. All your lies, all your schemes, everything was about to come crashing down. You couldn't let that happen, could you? Jacob's face contorted with rage. He slammed his hands on the table, sending papers flying. You don't understand. She was going to destroy everything. Years of work, my reputation, my life. She was going to throw it all away over some stupid moral high ground. The room went deadly quiet. Even Stern looked shocked at his client's outburst. Hayes slowly gathered the scattered papers, her movements deliberate. Thank you, Mr. Williams. That was very illuminating. I want to speak to my client alone, Stern said quickly, but the damage was done. Jacob's outburst had confirmed what Hayes already knew. This had never been about an accident on a hiking trail. As officers led Jacob to a holding cell, Hayes returned to her office. She picked up her phone and dialed the district attorney's number. We've got him, she said simply. He just confessed, not to the murder directly, but to the motive, combined with the evidence we have. The DA's response was immediate. Get me everything you have. We're filing charges tonight. In his cell, Jacob Williams sat with his head in his hands, his perfect facade finally crumbling. He'd thought he was smarter than everyone, smarter than the investors he'd cheated, smarter than the authorities, smarter than his wife. But Sarah had outsmarted him in the end, documenting everything, leaving a trail of evidence that would ensure justice even after her death. The holding cell's fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across Jacob's face as he sat across from Hayes, his lawyer notably absent. After his outburst in the interrogation room, he'd spent a sleepless night in custody. Now, early morning sunlight barely penetrated the small window high on the cell wall, and Jacob looked like a man who'd aged years overnight. I want to tell you what happened, he said quietly, his voice hoarse. But I need you to understand, I never meant for any of this. Hayes placed her recorder on the metal table between them, pressing the record button with a soft click. Take your time, Mr. Williams. Start from the beginning. Jacob ran his hands through his disheveled hair, his wedding ring catching the harsh light. Sarah was always the smart one, you know? The careful one. I should have known she'd figure it out eventually. He laughed bitterly. She found the first discrepancy in March, a transfer that didn't match our tax records. I told her it was a clerical error. But she didn't believe you? No. She kept digging. Every time I came home, she was at her computer, going through more records. I'd find her up at 3 in the morning, scanning documents, making copies. He shook his head. I tried to stop her, told her she was being paranoid, but Sarah, she was like a dog with a bone when she thought something was wrong. Hayes remained silent, letting him talk. Sometimes silence was the best interrogation technique. The week before our anniversary, she finally confronted me with everything she'd found. All the fake accounts, the missing money, everything. She said she had copies stored somewhere safe, said she'd go to the authorities if I didn't confess and pay everyone back. Jacob's voice cracked. But I couldn't. There was nothing left to pay back. What do you mean? The money was gone. Bad investments, gambling, living beyond our means. I'd been robbing Peter to pay Paul for years, moving funds around to cover the holes. If it all came out. He trailed off, staring at his hands. So you suggested the anniversary hike, Hayes prompted after a long silence. Jacob nodded slowly. I thought maybe I could convince her, make her understand what was at stake. We'd always done our best talking on trails, away from everything, but she wouldn't listen. His voice grew quieter, almost whispered. We reached the overlook, and she started talking about the SEC again, about how she had an ethical obligation to report me. She pulled out her phone, said she was done waiting, that she was going to call her lawyer right there. Hayes watched as Jacob's hands began to shake. What happened then? I grabbed for her phone. She fought back. That's how her gloves got bloody. She scraped her hands on the rocks, trying to keep her balance. We struggled, and then he swallowed hard. She was so close to the edge. I just wanted her to stop talking, to give me time to fix things. I pushed her. Not hard, I didn't mean to, but she was already off balance. Tears finally broke through his composed facade. The look on her face as she fell. She wasn't even scared, just disappointed. Like she'd known all along I'd do something like this. The confession room fell silent except for Jacob's ragged breathing. Hayes let the silence stretch, let the weight of his words sink in. After she fell, I panicked. I threw her gloves in my backpack, grabbed her phone when I found it on a ledge. Tried to make it look like an accident. He looked up at Hayes, his eyes red. I kept telling myself it was an accident, that I hadn't meant to do it. But I knew the moment I pushed her that I'd been planning it all along. Why else suggest that particular trail? Why pick the most dangerous overlook? Hayes leaned forward. And the money? The transfers you made the day before. Last desperate attempt to hide everything. I thought if I could just move enough around, make it disappear completely, there'd be nothing for anyone to find even if they looked. A hollow laugh escaped him. But Sarah had already found it all, hadn't she? Made all those copies I couldn't find. He slumped in his chair, the fight going out of him completely. She was always smarter than me, always one step ahead. I killed her to keep her quiet, and she still managed to talk. That USB drive you found? She knew someone would find it. She knew I'd crack eventually. Hayes stopped the recorder, gathering her notes. As she stood to leave, Jacob spoke one last time, his voice barely audible. The worst part? She was right about everything. About the money, about me. I'm exactly what she thought I was. A fraud. A coward. A murderer. The heavy door clanged shut behind Hayes as she left, leaving Jacob alone with the weight of his confession. In her office, she would type up the official statement, but she already knew. The case was closed. Sarah Williams had solved her own murder before it even happened, leaving a trail of evidence that would ensure justice even after she was gone. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters on the first day of the trial, their cameras flashing as Jacob Williams was led inside in handcuffs. He'd traded his hiking clothes and business suits for a plain navy courtroom outfit that made him look smaller, somehow more ordinary. The man who'd once commanded boardrooms and managed millions now kept his eyes down, avoiding the crowd stares. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with tension. Sarah's family sat in the front row behind the prosecution, her parents holding hands, her sister Emily clutching the old yearbook where she'd found the USB drive. Behind them, several of Jacob's former clients had come to watch, their faces hard with anger over both the financial and human toll of his crimes. District Attorney Maria Rodriguez opened with a statement that silenced the room. "This case is about two betrayals," she began, her voice carrying to every corner. First, Jacob Williams betrayed the trust of his clients, stealing their life savings to maintain his lifestyle of lies. Then, when his wife Sarah discovered his crimes and planned to expose them, he betrayed the ultimate trust. He took her life to keep his secrets. The defense tried to paint a different picture. Jacob's lawyer argued that what happened on Wildwood Trail was a tragic accident born of emotional distress. "My client was desperate, yes. Frightened, yes. But he never intended to kill his wife." In the heat of an argument, a simple push led to unimaginable consequences. But the evidence told a different story. Detective Hayes took the stand early in the trial, laying out the investigation's findings with methodical precision. She walked the jury through crime scene photos, financial records, and the careful trail of evidence Sarah had left behind. The victim knew she was in danger, Hayes testified, pointing to entries from Sarah's documented timeline. She didn't just stumble upon her husband's crimes. She investigated them thoroughly, protected her evidence, and prepared for the worst. The USB drive hidden in her yearbook wasn't just evidence of financial fraud, it was a dead woman's testimony. The prosecution called a parade of witnesses. Megan Porter's testimony about Sarah's growing fear in the weeks before her death brought many jurors to tears. The hiker who'd witnessed the argument in the parking lot described how Jacob had grabbed Sarah's arm, his face dark with anger. Forensics experts explained how the blood patterns on Sarah's glove showed she'd fought for her life. But the most damaging testimony came from Jacob himself. Under cross-examination, his carefully constructed story began to crumble. Rodriguez pressed him on the financial records, the timing of his money transfers, the choice of hiking trail. "Mr. Williams," Rodriguez asked, her voice sharp, "why did you suggest Wildwood Trail for your anniversary hike? There are dozens of safer trails in the area." Jacob shifted in his seat. "We'd hiked it before. It was special to us." "Really? Because according to your own credit card records, you'd never been there together. In fact, the only record we have of you visiting that trail was 2 weeks before Sarah's death, when you went alone. Were you perhaps scouting the location?" The question hung in the air as Jacob's face went pale. In the gallery, Sarah's mother let out a soft sob. The trial lasted 3 weeks, each day bringing new revelations about the extent of Jacob's deception. Former clients testified about life savings lost to his schemes. College funds, retirement accounts, charitable trusts, all gone, funneled through his web of fake accounts. When the jury began deliberations, no one expected them to take long. Still, the speed of their return, just 4 hours, surprised even veteran courthouse observers. The foreman stood, paper trembling slightly in his hands. "On the charge of first-degree murder, we find the defendant guilty. On the charges of financial fraud and embezzlement, we find the defendant guilty." Jacob showed no emotion as the verdicts were read, but his shoulders sagged as if a great weight had finally settled on them permanently. The judge's voice was stern as she handed down the sentence: life in prison without possibility of parole, plus 30 years for the financial crimes. As officers led Jacob away, Sarah's sister Emily stood up. Their eyes met briefly across the courtroom. In that moment, Jacob seemed to age years, finally confronting the full weight of what he'd done. Outside, reporters clamored for statements. Detective Hayes slipped away from the crowd, walking to her car in the fading afternoon light. In her pocket was Sarah's USB drive, its contents now part of the official record. She thought about Sarah's meticulous documentation, her careful planning, her determination to expose the truth even if it put her in danger. The case had changed how Hayes viewed victim evidence. Sarah hadn't just gathered proof of financial crimes. She'd documented her own murder investigation, creating a trail that led directly to her killer. In death, she'd achieved what she'd fought for in life: justice, truth, and the exposure of Jacob's crimes. As the courthouse emptied and the sun set over Boulder, the mountains stood silent in the distance. Somewhere on Wildwood Trail, a small memorial marked the spot where Sarah Williams had taken her last stand for truth. Her story would be remembered not just as a tragedy, but as a testament to one woman's courage in the face of betrayal. 1 year after Jacob Williams' conviction, Sarah's family gathered in a small conference room at the Boulder Community Center. The space had been transformed with photos of Sarah, not just the somber images from news reports, but pictures of her laughing with friends, hiking her favorite trails, celebrating life's small moments. On a table near the entrance, a stack of brochures announced the launch of the Sarah Williams Foundation. Emily, now the foundation's director, stood at a podium addressing the room full of domestic abuse survivors, financial crime victims, and local law enforcement. Her voice was steady, though her hands gripped the podium tightly. "My sister was more than just a victim," she began. "She was a fighter, an investigator, and ultimately, a protector. Even when she realized she might be in danger, she didn't just run. She gathered evidence, created safeguards, and made sure the truth would come out no matter what happened to her." Detective Hayes sat in the back row, watching the ceremony. She kept in touch with the family over the past year, helping them understand how to turn their tragedy into something meaningful. The foundation would focus on 3 main areas: supporting victims of domestic violence, educating people about financial fraud, and providing resources for whistleblowers. After the ceremony, Hayes walked with Megan Porter through the community center's garden. The spring air carried the scent of newly bloomed flowers, so different from the pine-scented mountain air of that fatal day. "I keep thinking about those last conversations with her," Megan said, stopping near a bench. "She was trying to tell me something was wrong, but I didn't push hard enough. I should have seen the signs." Hayes shook her head. Sarah made her own choices. She knew the risks and faced them head-on. That's why we're all here today. The foundation's first initiative was already making waves. They'd established a secure hotline for people who suspected financial fraud, partnering with legal experts to protect whistleblowers. 3 major fraud cases had been exposed in the past month alone, thanks to tips from people inspired by Sarah's story. Back at the police station, Hayes kept Sarah's case file in her desk drawer. Sometimes, on tough cases, she'd review it, remembering how one person's determination to expose the truth had changed so many lives. The file had become required reading for new detectives, a testament to the importance of looking beyond the obvious in domestic violence cases. The Financial Crimes Unit had undergone changes too. Sarah's methodical documentation of Jacob's fraud had exposed weaknesses in how they investigated white-collar crime. New protocols were implemented, and detectives received additional training in recognizing the intersection between financial crimes and domestic abuse. On Wildwood Trail, the spot where Sarah fell had been transformed. A small memorial plaque now marked the location, but it wasn't just about remembering tragedy. The site had become a symbol of resistance, of standing up to abuse in all its forms. Hikers often left flowers or small stones, a tradition that started spontaneously and continued through all seasons. Detective Hayes made the hike herself occasionally, usually early in the morning when the trail was quiet. On this particular morning, she stood at the overlook, watching the sun rise over Boulder. The city was waking up, people starting their daily routines, most unaware of how one woman's courage had made their community safer. In prison, Jacob Williams had become just another number in the system. His financial empire had crumbled, his stolen millions recovered and returned to their rightful owners. He tried to appeal his conviction once, but Sarah's carefully gathered evidence had made the verdict bulletproof. The last time Hayes checked, Jacob had started writing a memoir, claiming he wanted to warn others about the dangers of greed and desperation. The publishers weren't interested. Sarah's story, they said, was the one people needed to hear. As Hayes walked back down the trail, she thought about all the other Sarahs out there, people trapped in dangerous situations, gathering evidence, planning their escape. Thanks to the foundation, they now had somewhere to turn, resources to help them, and a community ready to support them. The morning sun cast long shadows on the trail, but the path ahead was clear. Sarah Williams hadn't just solved her own murder, she'd created a legacy that would help others find their way out of darkness. In the end, her greatest victory wasn't exposing Jacob's crimes or ensuring his conviction. It was showing others that one person's courage could light the way for countless more. Back in her office, Hayes opened a new case file. There would always be more Jacob Williamses in the world, but thanks to Sarah, there would also always be people ready to stand up to them, to gather evidence, to fight for truth. The file's first page remained blank, waiting for the next story to unfold, the next battle for justice to begin. In Boulder and beyond, Sarah's story had become more than just a cautionary tale. It was a blueprint for hope, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, one person's determination to expose the truth could change everything. The foundation bearing her name would ensure that her fight continued, helping others find their voice, their courage, and their path to justice.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.